Hello, I'm Resi from Lowell Observatory, and this is this week's Mars Hill Almanac. This week we're going to check up on our planets, and we're going to take a look at some prominent spring constellations and the objects that you can find using them. Let's start with the sun. The sun sets tonight from here in Flagstaff at 7:30 p.m. As we get closer to our summer solstice, the sun will be setting later and later every night. We're still in that period of low solar activity, so don't expect to see too much on the sun. However, this week we have been able to spot a couple of very tiny sunspots. The moon is currently new, meaning that tonight you will not be able to see it in the sky, but throughout the week you will see it go from a very thin crescent to almost a half moon. Venus is low in the sky in a thin crescent phase just after sunset. For those careful observers, you may be able to spot Mercury in the sky just above Venus, though it is very dim and kind of tricky to spot. If you're having trouble spotting Mercury and would like to see it, a small telescope or even a pair of binoculars can really help bring this tiny planet out. Jupiter rises here in Flagstaff, Arizona at 11:30 p.m., earlier and earlier every night. Jupiter and Saturn are still very close to one another in the night sky, though they are moving further and further apart until they come back together again in December this year for the Great Conjunction of 2020. Mars follows Jupiter and Saturn about 2 hours after Jupiter rises. And as you've been able to in the last few weeks, these three planets make a beautiful line in the morning sky. Now let's go ahead and talk about some spring constellations. Last week we talked about the northern sky, and I showed you how you can use the Big Dipper to spot some different objects in that northern sky. We're actually going to use the Big Dipper again to spot some objects in the eastern and southern sky. Now returning to that Big Dipper, if you remember, this star here is Mizar and Alcor, and up here is Al-Qaeda. Drawing a line from these stars and continuing it onward high into our spring sky, you will see this bright orange star. This is Arcturus inside the constellation Boötes. A lot of people who are new to stargazing can mistake Arcturus as a planet because of its orange color. It is a star, however, and it is orange because it is in a different part of its evolutionary path. Now, continuing that line from Al-Qaeda to Arcturus, you'll see another bright star. This star is Spica inside Virgo. Virgo is a very important constellation in the spring sky because it is right next to the Virgo Cluster, a large grouping of galaxies in our sky, which we'll talk about how to find in just a moment. Before we talk about spotting galaxies, your deep sky challenge this week is something a tiny bit easier. We're going to try to find a globular cluster, which is my personal favorite type of object. Returning to the Big Dipper and that star Al-Qaeda, and just a little bit above it, you are going to see another moderately bright star called Corcoroli. Now, if you draw a line from Corcoroli to Arcturus, directly between these two stars is M3, which stands for Messier 3, the globular cluster. You can spot this with binoculars as a very fuzzy star. However, the larger telescope you use to look at this object, the more distinct you'll see it. Through a moderate or large telescope, inside M3 you can see countless stars. Though it looks very small as an object, that is only because this globular cluster is very far away. Globular clusters are actually very large. They can span to almost 100 light years across and contain 500,000 stars. If M3 was easy for you, you can challenge yourself to try to find some of the galaxies in the Virgo cluster. So moving onward, back to Spica, that bright star in Virgo, just a little bit above it on the horizon by about 10 degrees and to the west. If you do a long exposure, if you're into astrophotography on this part of the sky, you will see countless galaxies. You can spot many of these galaxies through a small telescope, though the larger your telescope, the more galaxies you will be able to spot. Last week, we asked you about your experiences observing galaxies. Rick from New Zealand shared with us that he can very occasionally spot Andromeda Galaxy in his southern hemisphere sky. This week, we want to hear from you. I told you that globular clusters are my favorite objects to observe. I want to hear what your favorite objects to observe are. Just like last week, we'll be combing through your comments, picking our favorite, and sharing it in next week's episode of the Mars Hill Almanac. Until then, I'm Rezi from Lowell Observatory. Thank you for tuning in this week. We'll hear from you next week.